This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. During tax season, your personal info travels to a lot of places, between payroll, your tax consultant, and the IRS. If your W-2 gets exposed, that's just the ticket for identity thieves. That's why LifeLock monitors millions of data points every second. If your identity is stolen, they'll fix it guaranteed or your money back. Don't let identity thieves take you for a ride. Save up to 40% your first year. Visit LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Reclamation Podcast, where our goal is to help you reclaim good practices for life and leadership in Christ. My name's Tony and I'm your host. I'm so excited to bring you today's conversation with Bill Yo. Bill is an author and an entrepreneur, and his book, Unvarnished Faith, is an incredible testimony about how God worked in his mission trip to Nicaragua. I loved his heart. I appreciated the way he talks about his family and his servant's heart. He's got an incredible faith, and I think you're going to love his leadership principles. There's so much here for you to unpack. As always, guys, I'm thankful for you being a part of the Reclamation community. Do me a favor, share this episode with a friend, maybe somebody who you know is got a faith that's unvarnished, or runs a family business, or wants to learn how to live out their faith on an everyday basis. Now, without any further ado, here's my conversation with Bill Yo. I'm so excited to have Bill with me today. Bill, thank you so much for the time.
Thanks, Tony. It's my pleasure to be here. I'm very honored.
Well, one of the things I like to jump into kind of from the macro perspective is kind of a talk about calling. And I'm curious, how would you describe the calling that God has placed on your life? You've done lots of different things over the years. Of course, a lifelong writer and a poet, an author, speaker. How would you describe what God has called you to?
Wow, you start with an easy one, huh? Yeah, no, it's a great question, and thank you for that big opening. I spent 25 years of my adult life, my business, my career mostly in the business world, and in a very secular sense, doing those kind of things. But about I guess 8 years ago by now, I had a real earthquake in that path, if you will, and it was my mother passing. And, it was sad, of course, losing my mom, that inevitable sadness that almost everybody appreciates. But it was also very beautiful, and it was beautiful in the sense that there was this sunset streaming through this huge window next to her bed. We were all surrounded. She was surrounded by loved ones. I was holding her arm as she passed. But it was also beautiful because I was aware of the moment that her suffering ended and she went to be with God. And God physically pushed on my chest in that moment. And it was a sense and an emotion and a feeling that I'd never had before. And so with all the overwhelming I had of my mom passing, I had this other sort of overwhelming of just this incredible power of the Holy Spirit. And at the time I didn't have the words or the act, I didn't have the awareness to know what the heck was going on. But in not too much later with discernment and thinking through this, I kind of realized, wait, it's time for me to change what I'm doing. And so within a couple of months, I decided to pull out of a lot of my business activities, and it's a family business working with my siblings. I'm still involved, but not nearly the extent I was. A few months later, decided I'm going to research and write a book. A few months later, joined my first small group. A few months later, my first mission trip. And just it was this gradual calling to go to your question of trying to discern more of what God is revealing to me about what are my talents and gifts? What am I doing to deploy them to help other people? How am I using the discretion that I have around my time, talents, and efforts to make the world a better place and to serve God by serving others? And that's kind of the shortest the shortest way I can explain about what my calling is and what the last half dozen years have looked like. So,
I heard you mention the word discernment, and I want to drill down on that just a little bit because I think that there are a lot of leaders listening who feel called in so many different directions because they got a lot of options, right? Just like you got a lot of options. How do you discern God's voice versus
the neighbors or the pizza you had last night or anything else.
Well, particularly the pizza you had, because it's like, all right, is that revelation or is that indigestion? Kind of going right.
Amen.
But I talk about this toggle that God reveals, I discern. God reveals, I discern. And I know, or I believe that I missed the vast majority of the revelation that's put before me, because some of it is put in front of me in ways I can understand. Some of it could be a bird landing on the balcony outside. Some of it could be a feel in the air, whatever it is. But the more that I've found when I've had the choice to do different things, if I can discern on which of these things would model the life and the teaching and the ministry of Jesus, which of these things would be more consistent with what the Bible is teaching me about how to be a good person. If I take that option, I'm finding more time, or literally every time, things are kind of working out better. So I facilitate a couple of small groups, and one I run during the summer. This summer, we're running a surrender series, and the whole idea is what does it mean to surrender to God's will? And there's a lot of leaders and type A people and things like that in this group, and we've all been taught in our lives that surrender is losing, surrender is weakness, surrender is acquiescence, surrender is a form of an inferior way of being. But the reality is, through a biblical and a Christian lens, surrendering to God's will is the ultimate form of strength and the ultimate form of presence and the ultimate form of letting go of control and being who God created us to be. And so that, to me, all comes back to that discernment piece about, if I'm trying to truly listen, not just to my heart or to my ego or to my parent, but just my head, but I'm trying to listen to my heart and what God is saying to me and through others to me, then, that's the path that I'm trying to walk. So
that's a beautiful response. And I think I really like the way you ended it. That's a path I'm trying to walk, because I think it's definitely more of a spiritual practice and not a spiritual, completely defined
sometimes
spiritual law.
Sometimes I think the next step is being illuminated, and I was like, oh, nope, that's not it.
Nope. Right.
God just wanted me to be sure, look, take a peek, but that's not where you're heading, pal. Come on back and let's head this way. So,
one of the things that I appreciate about your bio, as I was kind of diving into your life, is one of the descriptions I see repeatedly is a lifelong writer. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that. I found some of your poetry online as well, and I'd love to hear this kind of discipline of writing. I think a lot of leaders are looking for clarity, and I think writing is one of those gifts. When did you realize it was such a transformational practice in your life, and what's it look like on a random Tuesday?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and forgive me for getting a little wonky here in terms of the art and the craft of writing. But yeah, I've always enjoyed being a communicator, whether it's orally, written, visual, whatever. And I think I've known since a young age, since probably high school, that I've enjoyed the craft of writing and communicating through writing, short form, long form, nonfiction, fiction kind of thing. And again, in this long business career I talked about, I always wrote. I wrote all the time. But what's very interesting about it is writing in a business sense is not unlike, if a preacher were preparing a sermon. So I'm told, I've never been a preacher or given, formally given a sermon, if you will. But, it's the whole thing about you tell them what you're going to tell them, and then you tell them, and then you tell them what you told them. So it's about repetition. It's about everything else. And the first draft of my first book, I kind of wrote each chapter that way. And my editor said, why are you giving away all the punchlines and all the climaxes right in the introduction? And this light switched for me. This light switched to the fact of, wait a minute, the best form of writing is storytelling, and storytelling is the oldest form of written communication. And it's the best form of sales. It's the best form of influence. It's the best way to have people empathize and connect with your message is telling great stories with interesting, complex characters with strengths and flaws and everything else. And so while both of the books that I've written have been nonfiction, it still has to do with plot. It has to do with character development. It has to do with interactions. It has to do with surprises. And I just enjoy that journey. And I try to write books that I would want to read. And I talk about, you mentioned a lot of leaders out there. In one way, for me, the most simple definition of a good leader is somebody who has followers. So similarly, the most simple definition of a good writer is somebody who has readers. And so I've tried to write my stuff in very relatable ways where people can maybe they can't connect with my professional walk or other things, but they can connect with some of the hardships in my life or some of the insecurities I have. And I've really just decided with my writing too, that the more candor I can put into my writing, and even though some of that stuff is pretty, kimono wide open type stuff, then the more I'm going to give other people the opportunity to step into more authentic versions of themselves. If they see somebody else, out there literally putting out there in the public domain, candid, unvarnished, to use my term, unvarnished versions of ourselves, maybe that'll help somebody else on their journey do the same kind of thing.
And do you have a daily practice, or is it one of those things you just write with
It's interesting. So when I'm in the process of writing a book, it's very much a daily practice. It's typically Monday to Friday, wake up in the morning, do my coffee, do my exercise, all those kind of things, maybe a bite to eat. Although I'm intermittent fasting now, I'm on that trend, so that's different. But no, then I go into my office. It's a closed, secluded space. Now my pugs are 14 years old, so they've been with me pretty much every writing day, but they sleep and they're great listeners. They don't give me a lot of negative feedback when I talk to them. But the adage with writing long form is 1,000 words a day. That's what most writers and most sort of trainings will tell you, is you really want to try and get 1,000 words a day. And so if you're going to write the book I just put out is 62,000 words, so that would be 62 writing days. And, so you kind of do the math there, but inevitably books are usually, manuscripts are longer, you pare them back. But at some point when you're getting near that, the words start to get jumbled, things start to, go sort of sideways a little bit. And then I know, okay, I'm done doing my quality writing for the day. Let me go into further research. Let me go into editing what I did yesterday, something on those lines. But then the last thing I'll mention too, because you mentioned poetry, is for me, when I'm writing nonfiction, it's a lot of right brain creative, but it's also a lot of left brain around what's the research, what's the history, how am I staying true to the actual story. So that's a morning regimented practice for me. I found more times than not when I'm writing fiction and when I'm writing poetry, I don't know when it's going to come to me. And a lot of times it might come in the evening, it might come at unexpected times. And I've learned for the most part, and my wife Kelly has learned for the most part, when that sort of inspiration, or maybe it's revelation, strikes, I have to go off, even if I can only just get on my tablet, if not on my computer, and there's something there that I want to get out. And so some of my favorite poems I've written in 20, 30 minutes at 10 o'clock at night when I wasn't even expecting to be writing, but it just hit me at the time. So
I am curious, your first book called Our Way, the life story of Spike Yo, this is a nonfiction book, and you're talking about your family. You work with your family. I didn't see a whole bunch of other members in your family as being a writer. Mm-hmm. From what now maybe I'm wrong about that. That was just research that I was looking on the internet. What did telling the story of Spike do to your family, and what's it like to be the quote unquote writer of the family?
Right. Well, no, and I think you're right on that we each have, not just my family, but everybody in creation has unique talents and gifts. And so maybe I was gifted with a writing talent that others don't, and they certainly have many, many talents that far surpass those same skills that I have. But it was really, as I said, kind of your first question of the conversation. It was a calling to say that our father's story, and by extension our business and our family, is a story that needs to be captured and needs to be communicated. And I just felt strongly about that. And I give my family a lot of credit, particularly my dad and my brothers with whom I work, that, they partnered with me in putting out, we didn't want to put out a puff piece, kind of like, oh, come on, nobody's this good. Mm-hmm. Like, what's really going on? So my father has, for the most part, lived a successful life. So the book is, let's call it 80% positive, 85, but that 15 to 20% of the underbelly, of the warts, of the real challenges he had as a child, of some of his personality and shortcomings, things he has, as an adult. Those are what bring the story to life. And so, again, as I said, I give my family a lot of credit because we talk about, some real challenges. By the way, challenges like divorce, like estranged parent-child relationships, like drug addiction, like alcoholism, like untimely deaths. Things, by the way, that every family has, whether you're in a socioeconomic level to own a big company like we do or not, every family deals with all these kind of things. And as I said, kudos that we were, as a group, willing to put that story out there. And again, as I had said earlier, maybe encourage other people to look more authentically at their own lives. So.
How do you know when the right time to share one of those vulnerable moments is, right? Like, because I've met some people who can be a little bit of an oversharer, and I met some people who are a little walled off. You mentioned the toggle earlier when it comes to discernment. Do you have another toggle when it comes to this story is now safe to share or not?
Boy, that's a good one. Certainly with that first book, not many of those sort of shares were about me personally. They were more about my family.
Sure.
So there was a slight degree of separation, but we probably had a 6-month sort of break, if you will, in the writing and the book process while the family was digesting and iterating and doing different things to make sure that we told the story in an appropriate way that was authentic and honest, but not overly so, if that makes sense. And I think we really did that. Now with me in particular, and some of the things in this newer book, I had the benefit of time, to kind of put something down, erase it, put something down, leave it there for a week, put something down, show it to somebody. And so I don't know that I necessarily have a kind of toggle or methodology for it. One of the things I do know is, for example, I mentioned a small group, and I participate in, 3 different small groups. And, there is a really warm and welcoming, almost kind of not even implied, but just a sense of confidentiality, and what I like to say is that, in those kind of forums, and by the way, it's the same thing when I'm in family business circles, when I'm at different conferences or conventions or whatever with other business owning families. The term I like to use is that stories stay, but lessons leave. So if I hear some story in some kind of an intimate or private setting that doesn't have full on confidentiality like certain, groups may, unless there's an express approval or allowance to share those stories stay. But I really encourage people, but what lessons did I take away from that story? And if I took a lesson away from that story, that's my learning and that's my sharing. And I can share what my lesson is without having to share that so-and-so, divulge this part about their past or this relationship in their life. I can stay away from that and say, hey, I heard something and here's what I took away from it. So stories stay, lessons leave.
I'm random kind of question about your small groups. Mm-hmm. I think a lot of guys especially are looking for community. How did you find the small groups? I love to kind of shout out kind of the practical part of this is how we found them.
Yeah, no, I love, actually the first one that I found was one that my dad was participating in the retirement community that he and at the time my mom, actually no, this was after my mom, lived out down in Florida. And so I started going on Thursday mornings with him, and I was probably in my mid 40s, and it was him and a bunch of 70, 80-year-olds all hanging out, but they were talking about the Lord and talking about their walk and talking about, if not books of the Bible, books that were certainly written about the faith life. And I just found a real sort of sense of community and growth there, and nourishment. Nourishment is kind of the term I use. So had this really cool experience maybe 6 years ago where 5 of us who all had gone to high school together. In fact, some of us had gone to school since kindergarten, and known each other a really, really long time. All were feeling called to be in fellowship with other believers and other people who were all just sort of in our 40s, just starting to examine our walk. And we realized that the 5 of us at the time were called to be in touch with the other 4, and there wasn't like a 6th person somewhere or one who wasn't. And so it was that revelation we eventually got and discerned that we should start a group. And now it's grown to that we've added somebody else. And what I joke about is, one of the new guys we've only known like 25 years. Everyone else is, goes 40, 45 years. And we've been together 6 or 7 years now. We've probably fumbled through, I'm going to say 25 books of the Bible or 20 books of the Bible. And we just finished doing 1st and 2nd Samuel, studying the life of David. Now we're in 2nd Corinthians. And it's just us trying to be better men, better representatives of what Christ taught us. But then I have another group that's more of a summer group that meets on the weekends, and we're doing a series on surrender, like I mentioned earlier. And last week, our subject was anxiety and anxiety's push against our ability to surrender to God's will. And so you had a bunch of, for the most part, 50 to 70-year-old men talking about anxiety and talking about fear and talking about doubt and talking about defensiveness and even control freakness. Being a control freak is a form of anxiety, a form of not living the way you're meant to live. And it was a pretty candid sharing of things. And as I said, I think, people respect that space and aren't going to go home tweeting about what so-and-so just said about things. So it's really special. And then the last thing I'll say about the small group is all three groups I'm involved with are men's groups, one at my church, one with my longtime friends, and then the summer one. And one of the things I've been really feeling in terms of revelation and calling recently is why just men? And why not, there certainly my church community has co-ed small groups and Bible studies and certainly plenty of them in them. And doesn't mean it has to be all couples, but, what might that look like otherwise? And one of the things I talk about in my book is ways that we knowingly, but also ways we unknowingly emphasize gender or overemphasize gender differences. Clearly, gender differences matter and that's important, but how are the ways we overemphasize? So that's just kind of a current, rumination going on within me. So.
Hey guys, just pausing this conversation with Bill to remind you to check out our brand new website, follow2leadcoaching.com. Follow2leadcoaching.com is my brand new coaching and strategic planning services. I am currently working with business leaders all over the U.S., helping them map out what it means to live in their faith and work. I think this is such an important role for every leader. How do we let our faith be a guiding force in our work and the role that we're called to play in the community? So if I can work with you, if you're someone who might want to take the next step in their faith and work and maybe even improve some of the goals that they have on an everyday basis when it comes to their faith and work-life balance and family balance and all the things, then I want to work with you. Go to our website, follow2leadcoaching.com, and let's set up a time to talk. I'm helping business leaders every single day, and I want to help you. Now, let's finish up this conversation with Bill.
Let's dive into the book a little bit. One of the things that is what is the catalyst for this book was this mission trip to Nicaragua and this journey, your first time mission trip. Kind of in my notes, it's like you went with your brother and some teenagers and like this whole journey. Kind of what made you say yes to this trip?
Yeah, no, it's a great question and a key part of my calling, to go back to how you opened the show. So my brother Jeff and his wife Suzanne lived down in the Carolinas, and they started, 15 years ago or 10 years ago, a Christian food ministry where they pack meals in churches and schools and different community facilities. And then these meals are shipped to underserved, underprivileged communities, both domestically and abroad. And they just this summer eclipsed 25 million meals packed. So just an incredible accomplishment. Right now, they're in the process of trying to fill an order for 1 million meals to the Ukraine. They certainly sent a lot of meals domestically, but Nicaragua is where a majority of their food has been sent over their time. And it's through a relationship they have with another ministry down in the Carolinas that has a connection to a ministry on the ground in Nicaragua. And one of the trips that they would run every year is for a high school in Charlotte. The first week of the new year in January, kids would go somewhere. You could do Habitat for Humanity, you could do coding, you could do whatever. Well, one of the trips was with Servants with the Heart, with my brother and his wife's ministry to Nicaragua. And he had asked me for a few different years to go. And my answer was always, geez, thanks, but no. And I felt kind of awkward, but it was these austere environments and these, undeveloped parts of the world or underdeveloped parts of the world. And, this God talk and all that kind of stuff was just not anything I was comfortable with. But, in the years since my mom passed and I was gaining more and more comfort with those things, I finally said yes. And I can, with hindsight, say the Holy Spirit finally said, dude, get with this and go. And I thought, I was going as a chaperone for these kids. Ostensibly I would be sort of in the background and, helping with their safety and everything else. And I had no idea that I would be ministered to not only by these children, but by the myriad locals that we interacted with, and how much growth I would get out of it, including ultimately leading towards, writing and publishing this book on the trip that you talked about. So.
What did you learn about God on the trip that you didn't know before?
Oh, man.
Or that maybe you had forgotten?
Yeah, no, that I didn't know. That first of all, a couple of things. First of all, ministry is a two-way street or a multi-way street, it's clear if I'm showing up as a missionary with food, with ready to pray over people, that there's a ministry function going on there. But what I saw back from these people ministered to me, and these children ministered to me in every way imaginable. And it was just an awesome, awesome way of how God works through everybody, for everybody. And just how it breaks down. And this gets into sort of my second thing, how, God does not see division. God does not see difference. God, transcends socioeconomic, geographic, cultural, language barriers, gender barriers. We had this amazing incident where we went to visit a trash dump, and people in this part of Nicaragua literally live in a trash dump because they're able to forage some level of value out of some of the trash and sell it for some way to sustain their families. But it's unimaginable. There's fires all over, mountains of trash. I mean, just acres and acres of this. And we talked to this one woman who lives there. We met her father and we met her children. So she's second of 3 generations being raised and living in this dump. And we asked her how she felt about that. And she said, we couldn't imagine, literally could not imagine. And her answer was, yo estoy contenta. I am happy. And, it was knock us over with a feather time. How can you be saying, I'm happy? And so if you want to know why I'm happy, that I woke up this morning, I didn't know how I was going to feed my children. I prayed to God and he sent you with food. So if you want to know how I'm doing today, I'm happy. Well, that to me was God at work. That to me was faith at work. That to me was this idea of unvarnished faith, which is the title of the book. That we get so caught up in places like the U.S. and what denomination are you? What church do you go to? What are the different prayers? What are the rites and sacraments and different things you've been through? But at the end of the day, it's if you have a need, you give it up to God, and God in God's time will answer that need. And I saw that in just an amazingly beautiful way, that all the material trappings and the doctrinal divides and the judginess and the platitudes and the things that can come with our more developed forms of faith can shadow. So
you seem like a really passionate guy to me. And one of the things that I would imagine is you go on this transformational trip, you come back, and now all of a sudden everyone in your circle needs to go on this trip. Maybe I'm off base.
Yeah.
But I'm curious how you live in that tension of like, hey, get your butt to a third world country and yet you're okay to live where you are. Where's the tension and all that for you?
I mean, Tony, I'm smiling because I literally an hour before we started talking, I got an email from somebody in my church group saying, hey, you mentioned something about you were going to, do some kind of work like that. What was that? Where is it? How can I do that? And this wasn't getting on a plane for a week and flying 2,000 miles away. This was, driving 45 minutes to a grossly underserved part of Philadelphia and doing ministry there. And I really, that's also opened my eyes. So I say yes, full yes to the overseas mission trip. Now, unfortunately, since the pandemic hit there's been a lot of issues with us taking groups back to Nicaragua. I was able to go a few times before the pandemic came, and then, pivoted to Africa at one point to do some work there. But what I found two things. Number one is just as powerfully, you can do work. You can have lunch. Like I had lunch at my house, went and did this mission work and was back in time for dinner. And I had this amazing experience with these people that are walking a very different walk than I'm walking, but they were created with every bit of right to dignity as I was. They're in the image of God every bit as much as I am. And if I have a chance to walk with them and be in relationship with them, even just for a few minutes, that can sustain them in ways. And yes, giving them food and giving them clothing and toiletries and other things, that material sustenance is helpful, but that spiritual sustenance through relationship and through eye contact and through maybe a hug or a prayer, that it's tough to calculate, how long that can buoy somebody who's struggling. So, and then the last thing too is, people of privilege, people of means are every bit as much in God's image and with dignity as others. And a lot of time people of privilege and of means are vilified in society. And so, I'm finding part of my calling is how can I walk with other people from developed socioeconomically, sort of positioned ways of life and walk with them and minister to them and be in relationship with them. And because if you can move the needle with those kind of folks, you can move the needle in society in some exciting ways. So it's not just what we would think about, traditional mission work or ministry to underserved populations.
One of the things that I know is common when people take trips like this is in the Army, we called it survivor's guilt, right? But like maybe another way to say it is privilege guilt. I mean, you spend a week in Nicaragua or even just the afternoon, and then you come back and, obviously, you very openly have admitted that you've got some privilege and means. And how does that tension, how do you wrestle with that tension? How do you live with that? How do you recommend to someone else who's like, oh gosh, it feels so awkward. Like if you were talking to somebody for the first time who just came back from their trip and now they hopped in their Tesla to go home.
Right.
What are you telling them?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's where you put your finger right on a real sort of nexus of the emotion and the journey that this puts you on. And, for the person who's been, it's wonderful because we can connect over it without having to really explain it. And an analogy I use there is when we were, our oldest child is 23, but when we were nearing the time when he was due, good friends of ours had had a baby maybe 6 months before. And I asked the father, my friend, I said, hey, what's it like? And God bless him. He was about to say something. He said, you know what? Call me afterwards. Like, I'm not going to tell you, just call me afterwards. And that was just the biggest gift he could have given me. So in some ways, that's more the thing is it's not as much talking to the people who have been through it, but the people who haven't. I just can't encourage folks enough to try and do something. Again, it doesn't have to be 2,000 miles away for a week. It can just be something short. And what I like to say is that if a picture is worth 1,000 words, an experience is worth 1,000,000. And so if somebody can have that experience of being in this place and having that sort of 5 sensory sense and smell and feel and touch and all those things about walking in that way and just being just having God be so present in those exchanges and in those moments, I tried my best in that book to write what it might be like for somebody and encourage him to do that, but there's no substitute for the experience of doing it. And from the survivor's guilt perspective, I would just say is number one, gratitude, just the gratitude for what we have. But then secondly, hey, take this as a calling. If you have that feeling, consider that that's the Holy Spirit compelling you to do more than you're already doing. And don't shun that away. Don't wait for that to disappear. Like, sit with that and let that in and know that the more you honor that and move to that, the more you're surrendering to God's will and living into who you were created to be.
One of the things I appreciate about the way that you talk about serving, it's very much a spiritual discipline for you. And one of the things that we say around here a lot is that if you're not dedicated to your disciplines, you'll be destroyed by your distractions.
That's good.
And so, I'd love to hear a little bit about what are some of the daily, monthly, yearly practices that you kind of like hang your hat on, or like, hey, these are the things that keep me healthy. What's that like for you?
Yeah, no, great question. And I'll sort of give two different answers to it. Number one is sort of from a community or a spiritual relationship perspective. And I think it was when I was reading Rick Warren, Purpose Driven Life, years ago, where I think he talked about sort of these three levels of relationship and community. Number one, and most importantly, is what's your personal relationship with God, your personal relationship with Jesus, and every one of ours is different. And then secondly, sort of what sort of smaller groups are you in, and that would be this sort of small group type thing or mission trip groups, whatever. But then there's like, what's your broader church community? And maybe it's your local church, maybe it's so how do you have these different ways of relating? And then how that's sort of intersected by the practices. Certainly we talk a lot about prayer and in my sort of journey, prayer used to be this almost like Norman Rockwellian thing of, on my knees, on my bed at night with the candlelight and just this very sort of serene, like, okay, now we're going to get into it. And prayer's evolved now to, sitting in a red light and saying, let me throw something out for that woman who looks like she's struggling, or for this thing that I'm thinking about, or, where am I going in my different relationships? So praying all the time now, I think, has been a real practice and development. Being in small group, one of my friends in my Friday group refers to it as we're here spiritual weightlifting. You have the other 6 mornings or 5 mornings every week. You can do your physical weightlifting, but this is spiritual weightlifting that we're doing now. So, for example, with one of the groups that I run, I encourage somebody different to end every week close us out in a prayer after we offer intentions. And some of the guys are really uncomfortable to do it, but I've never heard one who didn't channel the Holy Spirit and say something thoughtful and helpful to close us out. And guess what? That they've now done some weightlifting exercise they've never done before. And so they're stronger as a result of it. So, and I've had the chance now to start to go on some different retreats, maybe annual retreats to a local faith center or whatever it might be. And, just be in community with other believers for, a couple days, very immersively. And those are very powerful experiences. So, but it's different, I'd say, for everybody. So
that's good. I like the idea of the experiences, and that goes back to what you said earlier too about experience being worth a million years,
a million words,
a million words. Yeah. So that's I think that's very wise. I am kind of curious as this book gets out into the world. What is your prayer around it? Like when you pray for the person who's going to read it, what are you praying for?
No, that's great. My prayer is that, and again, whether it's one person or 1,000 people or 10 people or whatever, that they read the book, and the book ultimately is about the power of love and the centrality of relationships in our lives. I mean, that's really, if there's one takeaway, it's not about a walk with Christ. It's not about a commitment to it. It's about recognizing love and embracing relationships and investing in relationships and being the best, most authentic version of yourself you can be, channeling love and nurturing relationships. And so if somebody who reads it, even just sort of a 1 degree or 1 click move better in some community or some relationship they have, that to me would be a huge win and make it all worthwhile. So the book is broken into 6 different parts, and each part talks about a tenet that for me fuels love and relationships and fuels this idea of unvarnished faith. So I talk about character and dignity and talents. And I talk about serenity, failure, and gratitude. And so I've heard from different people, whether it's my children, people I'm in gospel reflection with, podcast hosts, people at different things, and I'll say, which one of them resonated most with you and why, and where does that come from? And just trying to show up for empathy with people so that they can see some part of their life that could be more intentional or improved as a result of it. So that doesn't mean more people on an overseas mission trip, more people dealing with food insecurity, more people going to church, more people, it can be anything for everybody. It's as long as they're doing what they have been individually created and intended to do, then that's the win.
That's awesome. I have one more question for you, but before I ask it, I know that my podcast family is going to want to connect with you on the interwebs. Mm-hmm. Where is the best place to learn all things Bill, and so that they can pick up their copy of Unvarnished Faith?
Yeah, no, that'd be great. We made it real easy. It's unvarnishedfaith.com. So just one word, unvarnishedfaith.com is our website, and that's where you can learn all about the book, and you can click over to Amazon to buy it. It became a #1 bestseller on Amazon the first week it was out, and we're just super proud of that. And but you can learn there about places I'm speaking and different ways to connect. I'm on Facebook, I'm on Instagram, author Bill Yo. That's YOH is the last name. So would love to interact in any of those ways and love connecting with people. So thank you for that opportunity to plug that.
Okay, the last question I want to ask you, it's an advice question. I ask you to go back in time and give yourself one piece of advice, except I get to name the season of life that you're in.
Okay. All right.
So I want to take you back to the end of your very first day officially working at the family business.
Okay.
Right? If you could go back to that younger version of yourself, sit knee to knee with him, look him in the eyes, hold his hands, and tell him one thing about the life he's about to live, what's the one piece of advice you've given him?
Wow. You start it with a big one and end it with a big one. So if I had to go back and sit, I like that idea. I like the visual, sitting knee to knee with that version of myself. And so we're going back to the mid 90s now. If I reflect on my walk and my journey since then, it would be something in the vein of continue to figure out who you are and be comfortable in your skin. Try not to overly chameleon towards what you think others may want you to be. try not to dwell on the past, try not to be anxious about the future. If I can be present about who I am being right now with the people in front of me, with the situation in front of me, and in whatever age appropriate ways, whether it's my 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, try and live into who that, if it will, maybe not best version, but a better version of myself. That would be excellent. When I think about sort of the less pleasant reflecting seasons of my life, it's where I've gotten away from that person I was created to be, and that image bearer that I have the opportunity to be. So yeah, it'd be something around there, just to try and discern, like we started, discern who I'm meant to be and live into that as much as I can.
All right, bonus question. Are you currently working on your next book?
I'm working on it up here. I'm not working it on here yet. So, but there's two projects. So one would be another nonfiction, but it's going to take a number of years. And the working title of it would be The Burrow of Abraham. So there's because as we know, we talk so much about the Judeo-Christian tradition, but Jews, Christians, and Muslims all cite Abraham as their father. So where we live in Pennsylvania, there's a community where there's a mosque which shares a property line with a synagogue, and across the street is a church. And they're in wonderful community. So this Burrow of Abraham, they're in this wonderful community with each other. In fact, they all worship on different days. They share parking lots. They've co-officiated weddings and all that. But the idea would be, how do we compare that homogeneity, that relationship, that quality and authenticity with what we see in many other parts of the world, including the Middle East and the Holy Land and some of those things. So that would be one. But the other one, which would be very fun, is I'd love to try my hand at long form fiction. And what I've talked about is there's nobody better that I or my family knows at predicting plots of shows and books than my wife, Kelly. And so if the family's watching a movie and she'll start to say something, they're like, no, Mom, nope, don't, we're not where you are yet. So I'd love to partner with her and write a story that she would not be able to predict the conclusion of. So
fascinating.
That's a really wide lane, and I don't know what that would be. I love that. She and I operate a business together, so I think we can work together. Sure. But that would be the one that Kelly couldn't predict. So.
Bill, I've been so blessed by our time today. Thank you so much for your generosity, for your commitment to the gospel, and to helping spread the kingdom message of love despite cultural tensions and differences.
Awesome.
So thank you for the time.
Thank you, Tony. I'm grateful.
I told you guys, what a great conversation with Bill. I love the way he talked about his prayer life, his intentional community, his small group, his scripture. I just think that there are so many nuggets that we can all pull from. And I'm thankful for you for staying all the way to the end of the podcast. Without guys and gals like you, this would not be possible. So again, do me a favor, share this episode with a friend, maybe somebody who you know needs to get into a community a little bit more, and tell them that you heard them here on the Reclamation Podcast. Those kind of referrals continue to help grow this platform and give more and more opportunities for God to work through this medium. As always, guys, I'm thankful for you. And remember, if you want to follow Jesus, you must be willing to move.